think we can start. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. My name is Vanja Petrovic, and I'm a program manager of the Southeastern Europe Observatory of the GI. And it is with great pleasure that I will be moderating today's discussion. Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar will discuss our recently published research on maritime routes of illicit trade and the role of commercial seaports in Southeastern Europe, or as we call it shortly, Port Holes Report. With us here today are Professor Anna Sergi, professor in criminology at the University of Essex. She specializes in organized crime and comparative criminal justice, and more recently in drug importations through seaports. Thank you, Anna, for being the part of our research team and for your valuable contributions to our report. With us today is Mr. Ruggiero Scattura. He's an analyst at the Global Initiative. He's been doing research on Southeastern Europe and Italian mafia-related issues. He was our lead analyst for this research and the first author of this report. Mr. Sasha Djordjevic is a field coordinator at the Global Initiative, field coordinator for Serbia and Montenegro. He was also part of the research team and contributor to this report. Thank you all for joining us today. So this report was published earlier this year in July, but in recent months, we worked hard on accompanying visual tools that would support us in disseminating our research findings and making it more accessible to broader audiences. We produced a short video highlighting some of the main findings of this research. And more recently, we launched our online visual tool that we will also briefly demonstrate to you today. So before I give floor to our speakers, we thought it would be good to kick off by showing you first our short video to set the basis for the discussions later on. The video is 12 minutes long. Please let us know in comments what you think about it, and please feel free to share this video later within your networks. We will leave the link in the chat box. I hope you will enjoy it. Can I please ask Zoom host to share, to screen the video? Thank you.
Drug trafficking is a global issue. With the rise of international trade over the last 30 years, there has also been a rise of opportunities to traffic illicit goods. More than 80% of the world trade is shipped via containers. But of these containers, only 2% are ever checked. And this can allow illegal trade to piggyback on the infrastructures and routes of the legal trade. This is the story of how that global trend is affecting the Western Balkans and why. So how did the Western Balkans get so involved in the global drug trade? It starts with the big picture. The demand for drugs in Western Europe is particularly high. The wars of the 1990s mean that many Western Balkan countries are young countries, still starting out. These wars yielded large numbers of individuals trained in violence. The economic instability also meant a lack of local opportunities, giving a life of crime more appeal. The flow of illicit money through these countries is around 6% of their GDP, and this comes with costs. The drug trade empowers and enriches organized crime. This can corrupt governments and destabilize the region. Then there is the opportunity presented by ports specifically.
Ports offer naturally the perfect conduit, the perfect place for illicit trade to infiltrate the legal channels. Around 850 million containers are shipped annually, and only from 2 to 4% are actually physically inspected and checked.
This is the area of the port of Koper, which is 290 square kilometers large. And beside that, we have an area on the seaside, which is off limits, which is 180 square kilometers large.
So normally containers will stay on the trucks and they will just go through a warehouse with a scanner. It won't pick up any illicit product, it will just pick up explosives or anything of that sort. Once the container instead is flagged by customs, it will be taken in a different part of the terminal and where customs will open the container, sometimes with the help of sniff dogs or sometimes with the help of specialized personnel.
New research suggests that the tentacles of criminal groups from the Western Balkans now extend all over the world.
From 2018 to 2020, we have seen a strong increase in seizures of cocaine. For example, in Durrës, in 2018, 613 kilograms of cocaine were seized in a container. Not far from here, in the port of Bar, for instance, more than a ton of cocaine has been seized in the same time frame. Given the low numbers of cocaine consumption in the region, we believe everything that passes by this region is meant to go to Western Europe. This is just a transit point.
Initially, criminal groups help other criminal organizations to traffic cocaine from Latin America to Europe. But right now, they're basically managing that business from production sources in Latin America to growing consumer markets in Europe. Europol estimates that currently at least 30% of drug trafficking from Latin America to Europe is in the hand of the Balkan criminal groups. The main aim of the Balkan criminal groups, like each criminal organization, is profit. There is no overarching organized Balkan cartel, but Balkan criminal groups operate in a cell mode. And right now there are 20 cells and each cell have 10 to 15 members. There are a lot of chains and a lot of links. It's not easy for law enforcement to tackle.
What tactics the criminals use to get ahead in their game of cat and mouse with law enforcement? How and where do they find weaknesses?
We have observed two main techniques of concealment of illicit substances inside containers: the hide and seek and the rip-on-rip-off. The hide and seek consists of filling fresh fruit boxes, typically bananas, with packages of illicit substances, especially cocaine in the case of flows from Latin America. Fresh fruits in general are the ideal carrier for illicit trade. They are shipped at a high frequency, and the fact that they're perishable needs fast and easy checks. In the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a general decrease of containers carrying general goods to Adriatic ports, but at the same time, we have actually seen an increase in the numbers of imports of bananas from Latin America and specifically from Ecuador. And this, of course, raises questions. The rip-on rip-off instead consists of breaking open containers that are sealed with custom seal and filling these containers with packages with boxes of illicit substances and then closing again the containers and put a fake custom seal. In Durrës, for example, there is a 5 to 10 minutes drive from where the containers are unloaded and where actually they are then checked. This is a huge opportunity for criminal networks to intercept the container and remove the illicit substances before the container is scanned.
There are, of course, maritime security systems and procedures that help the cats to catch the mice.
So usually containers are assigned 3 colors. The green when the container is free to go, then the yellow when there is reason to run at least a digital check on the container, and then the red when there is an alert. So in that sense, customs are required to physically inspect the container.
As with any regulation or anti-crime venture, the cat must be led by the tactics of the mouse. An arms race of defense measures and criminal circumventions develops.
The more you tighten up the security of ports, the more you push trafficking out of the port. Before, all you needed was a container that carried your cocaine, and then at some point in the port, someone would open the container, pick up the cocaine, and move out of the port. Now you have to make sure that the container leaves the port and goes to another location, where then you can go yourself and pick up the cocaine there.
Traffickers have developed new and more sophisticated concealment techniques. For instance, the use of big boxes attached to the hull of the ship under the sea level, thanks to the employment of specific divers. At the port of arrival, other divers are needed in order to unscrew this box and then take the drugs or the illicit substances. Another technique that we have observed in the region is also, for instance, the use of fishing vessels, leisure boats that approach big container ship and take the packages or boxes of drugs before the ship approaches the port. Another technique consists of dropping bags of illicit substances at sea before the container ship approaches the port and attaching a GPS tag on these boxes that can be, of course, then found later.
So what are some of the ways that authorities are trying to deal with the problem? One potential action is tightening port security.
In general, regional ports comply with international security standards, and this means the presence of security fencing with CCTV cameras coverage, and also special checking procedures. Port security improvement can include better and more security checking procedures, or even something like the deployment of underwater drones. In Durrës, for instance, we have observed the presence of more than 140 CCTV cameras. There is also 2 layers of fencing. A good practice in place is the fact that all containers coming from risky areas, for instance, from Latin America, are checked. Digitalization in general reduces risks of corruption and exposure to bribery. However, digital systems create new weaknesses, such as exposure to hacking.
Improvements in the security of ports will be in vain if they are undercut by corrupt officials, from dock workers to port and customs staff, or even high-level enforcement personnel who provide protection.
One of the recent cases that surfaced in public in Montenegro were referring to alleged involvement of the ex-president of the Supreme Court, Ms. Vesna Medenica, and her son. Europol was intercepting the phone calls between Ms. Medenica's son and organized crime group members, where we learned that Medenica was receiving a bribe in hundreds of thousands of euros in order to protect from prosecuting different organized crime groups. Every effort to fight organized crime in Montenegro was doomed even before it actually started, because she was in position to actually influence the decisions, the prosecutions, the judges, the outcomes of the trials. We have discoveries of the huge corruption and the organized crime, but at the end of the day, in most cases, it ends up with prosecuting the shippers or the custom officers or the port workers. We didn't have a single case when the prosecution and police actually discovered the seller or the buyer of the cocaine. So basically those results are not sustainable, and Montenegro is still rather frying the small rather than the big fish.
What then can be done regarding corruption?
When you look up, you will see the cranes, and the cranes will have different colors, usually with the logo of the company that runs the port. But in order to fight trafficking, you have to have involvement by the public institutions. We end up with private-public partnerships, which is a hybrid way to essentially make sure that everyone is able, both on the private sector side, so on the port authority side, the police and customs and whoever is running any type of intelligence on the cocaine trafficking, on the public sector, share information. Because the real issue with ports, all the ports in the world, is not only that they don't share information within the same port, but they don't share information across other ports.
In the Port of Koper, we have security coordination, which is bringing together all state players like police, customs, and maritime administration.
The Container Control Program of the United Nations has put in place encrypted communication between port authorities, but we have observed that there is still big room for improvement in communication and information sharing between port authorities and security providers.
Looking for contraband in containers is like looking for a needle in a haystack, but there are ways of assessing risk, following and cutting the supply chains and going after the big fish. This is an international phenomenon that requires international cooperation. Only by understanding the phenomenon and its causes can we begin to do something about it.
And we are back. I hope you enjoyed this video. As you could see, our speakers today are not only brilliant researchers and experts in the field, they are also great behind the cameras. So thank you to all three of you for starring in this video. Before I ask my first question, before we start this discussion, just a few housekeeping details. This webinar will be recorded. Only our speakers will have their cameras and microphones on. But please, I would like to encourage the audience to participate as well. Please use the chat box or Q&A box to ask questions or simply to share your thoughts and comments. We would really like to hear from you. We will have enough time in the end, probably 20 minutes, if not more, to ask all your questions. So please feel free to use these tools. Anna, I will start with you. You started researching ports about 4 or 5 years ago, if I'm correct, focusing mostly on ports of the global north. Can you share with us some of your main findings from that previous research? Why ports? How are they used? I mean, we heard a little bit from this video, but I'm sure you can tell us a little bit more in detail. And then another thing, you also conducted a research in the port of Piraeus. So how different or similar was that experience and the findings compared to your previous research in the field?
Yes, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here as always with the Global Initiative, and I'm so very glad that I was involved in this project, which was 1 year ago today, actually preparing for the fieldwork in Piraeus. So I'm going to share some slides and let me know if you have problems seeing them. Okay, so yes, you are correct, Vanya. I've been doing this research in ports not that long ago. I started in 2018, thanks also to a project funded by the British Academy for Social Sciences and Humanities in the UK. And then I met with Global Initiative to expand on that. So my research touched indeed the global north. And we start actually with Genova and Gioia Tauro, which are two ports in Italy. I come from studies of looked at the ports, whether they are interested in ports, how much can they actually, actively use the port. And then the project was run through ports of Melbourne, which is technically in the south, but I would consider it still quite western, northern typology of port. And to proceed with New York, New Jersey, which is a super interesting past. It's a super interesting past with organized crime in ports, Montreal, and then eventually the UK, Felixstowe, and finally Liverpool and Belfast. So when I approached Piraeus, I already had some knowledge of what to expect in ports, but obviously the project was very different. So in my previous port interest, what I was interested in was a very different variety of things, including corruption and cocaine, which emerged quite forcefully as an important element to consider. But I was also interested in how organized crime groups enter ports, so how they embed themselves in the port. With Piraeus, which by the way it was just outstanding in January, I must say, everyone should visit Greece in January, it's phenomenal. And I took fantastic pictures, and such as this one. So with Piraeus, it was a very different perspective, because it was a European port, but also in a region where without the European Union necessarily entanglement of legislation. So it was quite a unique case. So it allowed me to consider certain things that I hadn't considered before. The boring bits of why ports is the port are the essential nodes, the only essential nodes, the purest one in the capitalist world that we live in. That basically dictate how global supply chain, global trading networks, and global production network converge into one single unique hub. So ports are essentially dependent on models of capitalism. They are the purest example of our neoliberalist societies. They suffer, or they direct, they influence globalized economic tendencies, but they also are subjected to territorial and national institutional frameworks. So they are essentially the global and local place for excellence. Together with ports, we should also remember that we did a lot of work in that. I'm sure Ruggero can speak to it a little bit more, not just with ports, but also with dry ports. So which is where all the invisible activities of ports actually happen. So the beautiful part of this research was, first of all, to realize how invisible ports are to people who live around port, but how even more invisible dry ports are. So this is like very different kind of areas, gigantic sometimes, where logistic activities happen, where the boring bits of the port supply chain happen, or the cluster of production. So the global and local economic circuits of port is what drives and influences and is influenced by drugs and organized crime in this case. One of the myths of organized crime in ports is that organized crime groups control the ports. And this is something that actually led me to study this, because I couldn't believe it. And now I do know why I couldn't believe it, that anyone can control such a thing like a port. There is no control here. We are talking about a conditional opportunism for organized crime groups. Organized crime groups are obviously part of the supply chains. They know the supply chain. They can learn how to circumvent legislation around the supply chain, talking about the legal ones. But the only reason why organized crime groups can be successful through maritime routes is because there is success of trade already happening. So the resilience of a shipment route can ensure the longevity of the illicit trade. So organized crime groups don't choose necessarily where to send stuff. They can prefer certain areas rather than others, but obviously they are subjected to maritime routes more generally. But obviously, organized crime groups are more able to adapt to abrupt changes. They can. We've seen it during COVID, when there was fragmentation of the maritime routes across the world, and obviously that also meant some changes, very last-minute changes, had to be done with organized crime groups. If I'm expecting a shipment of cocaine in Antwerp, but my ship stops in Spain, then I'll have to arrange for that cocaine to be retrieved in Spain. So that needs to be done at a moment's notice. So it's important to understand who are the actors around ports that might or might not influence the success of organized crime into those ports, whether or not port workers are unionized, what type of governance employers have over port workers or employees more generally, whether or not there is a link, an historical link between criminal actors at the local level that also expand to the port, or whether we are talking about new actors arriving in a port out of other types of let's say interest. So it's particularly important also to understand how law enforcement organizes in ports, and I think that's where things become a little bit more complicated port by port. And the resources and capabilities of LA are crucial, of LEA, so law enforcement agencies. That's crucial, obviously, because not every state is the same. And we do have the same functions in port, but we don't have the same authorities exercising those functions. So that creates issues of coordination. So now that the boring bits is out, I can show you more pictures. So obviously Piraeus, as I said, is a fairly peculiar case because it's a port that first meets the Asian routes. So it's the port of entry for quite a lot of the Asian routes, but it's Europe. So the customs clearance in Piraeus is European custom. And obviously being Greece, such a particular country in terms of territory, so mostly water, mostly around water, but also having the border, sharing the border with the Balkans, that has meant a particular interest of certain groups for the port of Piraeus, precisely because it has jumped from 17th to 4th place in the space of 5 years in terms of volume of trade in Europe. So Piraeus has grown incredibly fast for a number of reasons that have mostly to do with the investments brought in by COSCO, which is a Chinese-owned maritime giant, and COSCO has made Piraeus essentially the jewel of its crown. So Piraeus has increased not just its volume of trade, but also security has improved drastically, and clearly the plans for Piraeus do not just stay into Southern Europe. Piraeus is effectively the first door to Europe with easy connections to Rotterdam, to Antwerp, to Germany, to all other European ports where also COSCO has interest. So the port of Piraeus has quite a long history, and the first thing you'll notice is that the blue cranes are COSCO's owned terminal, and the yellow one, which I'm not sure if you can see it, but are older and they look quite run down, are the once public container terminal. There is quite a difference between the container terminals in Piraeus. Most of the trade goes to the COSCO-owned terminal container, but because COSCO also owns the port, even at the time when Greece got rid of some of its assets during the financial crisis, essentially Piraeus is the one actor, COSCO is the one actor that arranges pretty much everything from security to trade, and obviously through modernization of Piraeus. Now, cocaine trafficking in Piraeus, and I'm going to look at the end here. Piraeus is recognized as the principal import or transit point in Europe. We saw that during the project, from large cocaine shipments from Latin American countries, primarily from Ecuador, because there has been a new established direct route, thanks again to COSCO, but also through Latin American ports, at times stopping in Spain or Italy, but at the same time added to Piraeus. Now, if you look at the map, it doesn't seem like Piraeus is the obvious choice for cocaine, because especially if cocaine is added towards the north of Europe. So why Piraeus? Why would you go so far? So it looks like a counterintuitive route, unless you realize that obviously what makes Piraeus interesting is precisely its location. On the one hand, you have direct access to the Balkans via land, but on the other hand, you have connections to the Netherlands and Northern European networks daily. So the promise of Piraeus, of COSCO in Piraeus, is that in 48 hours you can be anywhere in Europe. So that is quite attractive. Also, if you are choosing new routes for importing narcotics. Seizures in Piraeus remain small in quantity, but they are very frequent. So clearly they are not meant for the local market. They are exchangeable with Thessaloniki. So the two ports seem very connected in terms of groups that use them. So obviously they do present some challenges in terms of policing. But as I said, the most important thing about Piraeus is the rise in capacity from on the Albanian Western Balkans route. The port of Piraeus, by the way, is quite big in terms of overall area that it covers. It's almost 40 kilometers, and not all the port is interested by these events. So you'll see in blue the terminal containers that obviously are the ones we looked at in terms of cocaine. Where does cocaine arrive? They are not even in the city and municipality of Piraeus. They are technically in Perama and partially seen by Kerachini, which are the two municipalities together with Piraeus around the port. So it's quite a difficult area to police. More pictures of Piraeus or give you the presence of COSCO as a particularly important element of this. You'll see the Chinese-looking entry of Piraeus, but more importantly, the disappearance of the Greek language from the port. So there is quite an interesting, element there in terms of the foreignization of Piraeus. Piraeus is super secure in terms of technical security. It's been quite outstanding to see how nothing moves in on the terminal without, the usual security system in place, protocols, entry point, access point, ID cards, surveillance, and all of that. So the problem in Piraeus is really not about security, but rather about the fact that the incentives to ship to Piraeus outnumber the risks of being caught in Piraeus, essentially. So food for thought for the final points of this presentation. Illicit trafficking is very different from criminal governance in port. In Piraeus, we don't have criminal governance of the port. We have several groups investing in illicit trafficking in Piraeus. So it's very difficult for organized crime unit to follow what's going on in Piraeus. We have groups of Greek origin, of mixed nationalities, some Western Balkan nationalities mixed with Italians, mixed with Greek, mixed with everyone. We have the full exploitation of the European freedom of mobility with groups who use, for example, the Balkan route also for money investments. For example, you might ship cocaine and you might come to Piraeus pretending to be part of a company that is shipping, I don't know, marble from somewhere, and it's set up its head office in Bulgaria. So you have the officially legal reason to come down to Piraeus and pick up a container, which instead is carrying cocaine. So there is quite everything that we see in Europe amplified by the Albanian border and the Western Balkan routes more generally. So in Piraeus, port security is not an issue. We didn't have there wasn't any feeling that there should be something more done. So port security is not really about keeping out organized crime. It's about keeping the place safe from work accident, problems of any type of order and disorder management. But it does create displacement of illicit trafficking. It does create the need for organized crime groups to find new ways, and usually semi-legal ways, such as setting up companies in Bulgaria and sending people down to Piraeus to pick up the shipment, because it's not easy at all to access containers around Piraeus. So Piraeus obviously was the biggest port, but I'm not sure if it was the most interesting port of the GI-TOC study. I loved it, but I've read the rest with great interest. I think it adds to the study. It added to the study because it presents key policing and security challenges, because it's a first world type of port, different from other ports, which are still catching up in terms of security and policing in the same area. It does present a very obvious case of counterintuitive path of the drug trade, which you can only explain once you understand how effectively the drug trade works and why are groups interested in Piraeus. But obviously, it's also the reason why it was chosen in the first place. Is because it's one of the starting point of the Balkan route, and it gave actually a boost to the Balkan route, quite obviously so. So I'm going to stop here. I've used my 15 minutes. So if there are any further questions, happy to answer them. And I hope it was clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you so much for this great presentation. I'm sure we will have questions. I'm sure audience will have lots of questions. You did leave us with the food for thought. And Ruggero, now please tell us a little bit more about the rest of the research that was conducted in Southeastern Europe. So apart from Piraeus, which other ports were studied, and what were the main findings?
Yes, so good afternoon, everybody, also from my side. Can you please confirm that you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So, thank you very much, Vanya. Also, thanks a lot also to Anna, not only for your great presentation, but also for contributing, I guess, again, to this study. In today's session, I will present some of the main findings of our now 1 year old, I would say, report. Ports also exploring the maritime Balkan routes is the correct titles. This is our cover, and already from it you can see some of the most, I would say, recurrent items of our study. You can see cranes in the back, a container ship on the left, and above the title, actually a box carrying bananas and what seems to be allegedly packages of illicit substances, and very likely cocaine, especially when it comes to flows of bananas from Latin America. To give you a little bit of background information, given the news coming from Northern European ports, Rotterdam, Antwerp, also the port of Hamburg, or Le Havre, we started also looking at, of course, talking about news about major seizures of illicit substances, specifically cocaine. We started looking at our regional reference and wanted to have a look at what was going on. And these, you can see in the maps, are all customs and police operations, so seizures of illicit substances that were hidden in containers. So after looking at the quantities seized and also analyzing press releases by customs, police, and also in general police, also annual report, we realized then how important ports, and specifically, of course, the container terminals are and were and are still, of course, in the illicit flows to and through our region of reference. And so we decided to develop this organized crime and corruption based risk assessment of our regional commercial ports that you can see displayed in the map. We actually replicated the same sort of approach also to the Danube, of course, because of its relevance. It crosses Southeastern Europe from east to west. And these are all, again, customs and police operation along the river. Of course, here we didn't look at containers, mainly because most of the trade is carried through barges. And you can find also the full case study inside the case study dedicated to Constanza, especially because we gave a lot of importance to the Danube Delta, which is very close to Constanza and its ports. Before getting to the final list of ports that you saw before in the map, and also here listed under the national flags, we also we actually conducted a preliminary assessment on more than 20 commercial ports based on 4 main criteria. So before coming, of course, to the final list, and the analysis was based on, first of all, the port ownership. We had a look at the port ownership. So we wanted to assess whether the port was public or private. In certain cases, we actually observed that it was often the case that there were both entities. For example, the port of Bar as a private entity, which is the port of Adria, and also a public one, which is the port of Bar. Then we also wanted to have a look at this, the size of the port, so meaning how many containers are handled per year. So we had a look at the TEUs, which stands for 20-foot equivalent units. Then we also wanted to have a look at the relevance of the role played by the port from a commercial perspective, not only from looking at the connectivity from a maritime perspective, meaning to how many other ports our port under analysis was connected, but also from a land perspective. So we also assessed, and this actually is connected to what Anna said before, so the relevance of the port based on the presence of land-based trade infrastructures, such as train station, railways, dry ports, free trade zone, and so on, highways, and so on and so forth. Also wholesale markets, storage areas, and so on. And also a fourth criterion was we wanted to factor in also the criminological element. So we basically had a look at the history of seizures of illicit goods, specifically, of course, hidden. They were found by customs and police in containers. Now, as one of the results of the study, and also, of course, the field work that we have conducted, again, from November 2021 to February 2022, we also wanted to give our own understanding and categorization of the ports that we studied from a criminological perspective, meaning based on how, and specifically also why, crime and in general illicit trade manifest in port premises. As you can see here, we created 3 main categories: the trade giants, the crime magnates, and the safe havens. But before getting into the details of these categories, I also wanted to specify that these categories are not exclusive nor independent from each other. Actually, now thinking of it, it would probably be better to represent this list in a more harmonized way, for example, using a Venn diagram, where those circles have areas in common. That's because it might be, especially now after a little bit of time, major changes either from a security perspective, so for example, increased security, or major changes also from commercial perspective, for instance, private acquisition may have caused the fact that a port right now might fit the description of another category. So this is it's important to specify that this categorization really belongs to the time frame in which we conducted the field work. Now, this said, Anna has extensively talked about it, but in general, you can see Piraeus is the only trade giant that we have identified. This, of course, has to do with high level of throughputs that especially Costco's acquisition has guaranteed over the last few years, and as a huge port in general with millions of containers that are handled per year. The port of Piraeus in a way attracts many different illicit substances coming pretty much from everywhere, as Anna said before, from Asia, but also from Latin America, Western Europe, North America, and so on. In fact, Piraeus doesn't really characterize for any specific illicit substance. It's not the port of cocaine, it's not the port of heroin, it's not the port of counterfeit cigarettes, but it's of amphetamines, but it's actually the port of all of them. And from a criminogenic perspective, in general, of course, large ports have very complex and multi-stakeholder security system in place, which sometimes make it rather difficult for security providers to keep up with the large and fast as well streams of containers. Today, I was reading a quote by a customs official from the port of Rotterdam that says, and I'm quoting, "The biggest challenge is to find a good balance between the speed of logistics for the port and checking everything that we want." This basically, in a way, summarizes the fact that sometimes it's very difficult for them to keep up with private investment, especially. Constanza, Koper, Rijeka, Ploce, and Thessaloniki fall instead in the crime magnet category. These ports do not really have great throughputs. Here, of course, you had a look here at the number of TEUs processed and handled per year, and are not particularly also large in terms of geographical extension and coverage of space, and yet their geographical location at specific transport intersection make them particularly essential, not only for national seaborne trade, but also for regional or even generally international. Take, for instance, the role that Koper plays for companies from landlocked countries, so from Slovakia, from Austria, and especially for Hungary, or Ploce for Bosnia and Herzegovina, or Thessaloniki for North Macedonia, and also Western Bulgaria, and also south of Serbia. And now, for the same reasons that attract legit interest, which means, of course, the will of specific business companies in landlocked countries to have access to seaborne trade, criminal networks of especially, not only, but especially landlocked countries are particularly attracted to these ports. In fact, we have observed, for instance, the presence of criminal networks traditionally operating in Serbia, willing to exploit the port of Constanza in Romania, as well as North Macedonian-based criminal networks exploiting the port of Thessaloniki, as well as criminal interest basically originating in Western Bulgaria, also in Thessaloniki, and so on and so forth. So, for example, Bosnian networks, or better, criminal networks operating traditionally in Bosnia and Serbia, also operating through the ports of Rijeka and Ploce in Croatia. The last category instead is safe havens, and Bar, Durrës, and Varna fall into this specific category. And by safe havens here we mean ports that for their specific characteristics are particularly exposed to criminal activity. In the context of our study, we have observed two main specific aspects that strongly characterize these ports. First of all, the presence of organized crime groups that traditionally operate in the city where the port is located, and with the possibility to access port premises through, thanks to also legit businesses, meaning, in other words, that, for example, the ports fall inside the area of influence and operativity of specific criminal networks. In the case of Durrës, for instance, we have observed that arrested members of a powerful local clan at the time of their arrest were actually found in possession of official badges to enter the port, because they were running either logistic company with a venue inside the port, or were actually employed or had businesses with the fisheries. Another instead characteristic is the systemic, in general, lack of security and pervasive corruption that in certain cases suggested even the configuration of ports capture. This is something that in a way, of course, to different extents, but we have observed, for instance, when analyzing the composition of the board of management of the port of Varna. And many of the members were actually investigated for grand corruption, in general, corruption-related scandals. A little bit of the flows. These are, again, these are all vectors that we have built going backwards. So we started basically from the information that was shared by customs. We also built on existing knowledge of GI's work all over these years. As you can see, there is traditionally cocaine being shipped from both Atlantic and Pacific ports of Latin America, going all the way to northeast, either direction, Western Europe, or of course also to our region of reference, especially the port of Piraeus, and then might be that the load is shipped again towards other Adriatic ports or other ports in our region. Cigarettes traditionally being shipped from China and also the United Arab Emirates, going through the Gulf of Aden and then all the way up through Suez, and then either going to Turkey and then again to our regional reference, or directly to Southeastern Europe. And then heroin, traditionally, of course, being produced in Afghanistan, going through Iran, and then either via Turkey and then across the Black Sea, entering Southeastern Europe in the ports of Varna and then Constanza in the western coast of the Black Sea, or actually following basically the routes of cigarettes and then Gulf of Aden, Suez, and then our region. This is instead a close-up of basically the same vectors, but more into detail in our region of reference. I've said before, cocaine either arriving directly to northwestern Europe to supply the European Union markets, but also either stopping first in Valencia or Genoa or Napoli or Gioia Tauro, or even Malta. So Marsakloc is also a port which is extremely relevant when it comes to these layovers and stops, and then the shipment keeps going all the way to either Durrës, Bar, but also Piraeus, or through Istanbul, so the Bosphorus, and then the Black Sea. And we have a detail actually added here, which is also a detail that in a way gives also the name to our report, so the maritime Balkan route, which refers also to the fact that, if you can see here, there's heroin being shipped from the southern Turkish port of Mersin and Iskenderun that circumnavigates the Balkan Peninsula and enters our regional reference in Koper. So not only Southeastern Europe, but also the heart, I would say, of the European Union. Koper, where Slovenian authorities have actually seized more than 1.1 tons of heroin only in 2021 only. So it adds in a way a vector to the more, so to say, traditional land Balkan route. And then, of course, there's also waste. This is something that is not new. It's always been there, traditionally been shipped from Western Europe all the way to our regional reference, specifically from the port of Naples, and then going all the way to Varna and Costanza. Yes, this is instead a visual. We're going to talk about it also later in the context of presentation of our tool. This visual, in a way, summarizes all the consideration and all, that we have collected when visiting the ports. It consists of a made-up port with all components that we have, in a way, identified in our region when visiting our ports in the region. To each number, components correspond a specific vulnerabilities, and you can find also the full description of these vulnerabilities in our report. And very briefly here, I might talk about the scanners. Of course, everybody would agree that having new and functioning scanners is essential, especially for customs, of course, to physically inspect and check all the flat containers. And there are two types: the mobile, which can be brought everywhere in the port, of course, as close as possible, I suppose, to the loading zone of the container terminal. But there are also fixed scanners. In a case, and this is again in the context of identifying vulnerabilities, we have seen that the scanner was located 3-4 kilometers away. You also saw that in the video before. I was talking about the port of Durrës. We have observed that before getting to getting scanned, heavily loaded truck might need up to 10-15 minutes to get there, and of course driving all the way in hidden corners between piled up containers, for instance, all areas which are not covered especially by CCTV cameras might offer time and space also to potential offender to tamper with the containers. And then this, I think with this, I will give the floor to Vanya and then to Sasha, I guess. And then I will be back.
Yes, thank you so much, Jerry. So we now heard a lot about the port classification, about the flaws, and I think now it's great time to give floor to Sasha to tell us more about criminal actors. Sasha, in the short video that we saw earlier, you do mention criminal actors. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and tell us more who is operating inside the ports of Southeastern Europe?
Thank you, Anna, for the kind introduction. So basically, I will try to answer the question: who are the criminal actors operating in the 9 selected ports in Southeast Europe? And maybe, Ruggero, you can show the slide. Yes, thanks. Basically, we started the research team use an in-house typology developed by the Global Initiative to classify and structure criminal actors in Southeast European ports. I'm talking about the Global Organized Crime Index. And based on the index, there are 4 main criminal actors. So the first criminal actors is mafia-style groups. And this is basically clearly defined organized crime groups with a known name, with a defined leadership. There is a leader of the group with territorial control and the membership. And the second criminal actor is the criminal networks. So basically, criminal networks are webs of different criminal associations engaging in illicit activities without any specific territorial control, as, for example, for the mafia-style group. The third group is the state-embedded actors. As the title suggests, these criminal actors are linked with the state apparatus. So they basically operate in or from the different state institutions. In this case, for the port research, the most important are the law enforcement and customs. And finally, the foreign actors are basically different state and non-state criminal actors operating outside their home country. And from the map, as you saw, as you can see on the screen, so it's possible to conclude that criminal networks actually dominate Southeast European ports. So basically, you can see that in 5 out of 9 selected ports, which is Koper, Rijeka, Ploče, Varna, and Constanza. So they are criminal networks. The mafia-style criminal groups are mainly active in Bar and Durrës, while foreign criminal actors actually occupied Greek ports in Athens and Thessaloniki, as Anna mentioned at the beginning. But the situation is not so simple that actually, I don't know, for example, that one type of criminal actor is basically dominate on specific ports. Their links and associations and connections are very interconnected. So sometimes it's very difficult to identify which type of criminal actors is really on the ground. So basically, from the map and from the research shows that in Constanza and Varna, local criminal groups actually team up with different corrupt customs officials, dock workers, truck drivers, and business owners. But also what is important in these ports in Romania and Bulgaria, that a lot of foreign actors are active in these ports. For example, Serbs in Romania and Turks in Bulgaria. There was one big seizure of cocaine in Constanza a couple of years ago with the links with organized crime from Brazil. So again, we have another foreign actors. Foreign actors, as I said, are dominant in Greece. So basically, Albanians and Greeks cooperate with different criminal actors or individuals from Bulgaria, North Macedonia, and Turkey. And state-embedded actors are identified only in the port of Bar. And it's basically connected with the cigarette smuggling, which is the long issue in Montenegro, basically from the 90s. And there are a lot of controversy talking about criminal actors. For example, in the port of Bar, there are 2 main actors responsible basically for the cigarette smuggling. One is the Gran clan, and the second is the Mojkovac clan. And basically, since there are no court-proven law enforcement case. Reports and stories about the Montenegrin criminal organization are often very anecdotal with different stories which are not easy to prove, and especially valid for the Grand and Mojkovac clan because frequently this is the subject of very sharp debate between different political actors in Montenegro. So these stories about these two clans have always some kind of connotation of the conflict between or within Montenegrin security service, between influential political leaders and key political individuals in the last 3 decades in Montenegro. And because of no cases, basically no court cases done, it's very hard to find accurate analysis about the Grand and Mojkovac clan. But what is also important for the Port of Bar that actually individuals who try to find out more about activities of these clans basically were under attack. So, for example, the media in Montenegro believe that journalists from a daily newspaper Dan Duško Jovanović had been killed because of writing about the tobacco, the cigarettes mafia in Montenegro. Also, another journalist from Vijesti, Olivera Lakić, has been physically attacked, and her family also were threatened. And also another police inspector, Predrag Šuković, who openly said that politicians were behind the illicit business of smuggling cigarettes, actually also were threatened. And while the evidence he submitted to the prosecution has disappeared, and so far we don't have like any of these cases of threatening journalists actually have been solved in Montenegro, which is also one of the issues. Also in the port of Bar and the port of Durrës, especially for the cocaine trafficking from the Latin America to the Western Europe, there are basically 3 actors, 2 in Bar and 1 in Durrës, that operates like mafia-style groups. So these are the Škaljari clan, Kavači clan in Montenegro, and Lul Berisha clan in Albania. So Kavači clan and Škaljari clan were in the 2000, at the beginning 2000 until 2010, were part of the larger criminal organization. It's called the Kotor clan. And the first struggle within the clan actually was in 2012, but the final outbreak happening in 2014 in Spain, in Valencia, because of the cocaine. And after that, stole in February 2015, actually the bloody clash start with the mafia-style murders, killing, especially the first place was in Belgrade, Serbia. And until now, so basically a lot of investigative journalists and our research also showed that more than 60 person actually died in the clash between 2 clans. And one of the last victims is allegedly the leader of the Škaljari clan, and he was killed in September this year in Turkey. On the other hand, in Albania, the Lul Berisha clan also was part in the beginning of 2000, part of the Durrës gang, and that gang actually fractioned in 2002. Ports in Slovenia and Croatia, but also in Montenegro, are actually interesting because in these ports operate small cells of what Europol and media often call as the Balkan cartel, which is this Balkan cartel is very often in connection with these 2 criminal clans from Montenegro that actually I mentioned, the Škaljari and Kavači clan. And one of the main advantages of this criminal actor that basically there is no any language barriers. So basically the cells are constitute between like people from Bosnia, from Croatia, from Montenegro, from Serbia, and they actually speak one language. And there is also in Slovenia, and Slovenians can also easily understand the language that actually people from the former Yugoslavia also talk. And for the cocaine trafficking, this is very, very useful. And based on research during the port, we actually, in discussion, we find out that there are around 20 criminal cells of different ethnicity from the region that can be mobilized very easily, depending on the routes that actually is using after the, for example, cocaine arrive, I don't know, in Koper, and the port actually used. For example, from the Koper, there was also a case that Slovenian law enforcement started 2 years ago. It's it's basically the cell of the Kavachi clan in Slovenia that actually they arrested more than 40 persons, so all different nationality from the former Yugoslavia. And actually they use, like, the storage was in the Gorenska region in Slovenia, and there are two routes basically after that. One route go to the Salzburg and to the Vienna in Austria, and the second route is going to the Italy. So this is basically also what is important to know, that this also so-called Balkan cartel is also active outside the Balkans. And we actually talk also with the police officer why they start to use the ports in the Southeast Europe. And one of the argument, especially from the senior police officer from Montenegro, he thinks that the case is because their power in the Western Europe, especially in the Netherlands, in the Belgium and the Germany, actually is weaker because of this clash between Škaljari and Kavachi clan. And in the end, I think it's important to argue the existence of the Balkan cartel. So our thinking is that actually the Balkan cartel doesn't exist, because by definition there should be the whole chain of cocaine trafficking, from the production, from the money laundering. What we actually know, that without any doubts, that criminal organization and association from the Balkans cooperate and smuggle large quantities of cocaine from South America to Europe, even to Australia and Asia. But actually the existence of the Balkan cartel is under question. Nevertheless, so it's crucial that law enforcement cooperation in the Balkans be better and not be, like, disturbed by the political different political problems that actually exist in the region. So thanks, Vanya.
Thank you, Sasha, Ruggero, Anna. Really great presentations. I would just like to ask my colleagues. I mentioned earlier that we developed online visual tool that literally has been launched, I believe yesterday or day before. Ruggero, we will not show the whole tool, but maybe just to direct our audience to access it. Maybe if you can just show on the screen and briefly just introduce our visual tool. Then I would like to encourage the audience to please access it in your own time, play with it and let us know what you think. We are really hoping that this will be a useful tool for different stakeholders. Thank you.
Of course. So yes, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So first of all, why the tool? I think it's a fair question. The main reason that brought us to develop the tool is that we really wanted to keep on diversifying the way we showcase our research, because in practice it offers an alternative to a research report which is over 84 or 85 pages. It doesn't mean though that it replaces it. It's not an alternative stricto sensu, but it's more a way to complement the way we produce and the way we showcase our product. So it is something that in a way, gives a more interactive way, and I'm gonna go through it very briefly, but it also in a way enriches also the set of our products. As you can see, the tool is consists of five main components. Of course, there is a general description. The first section, if we scroll down, I'm just gonna talk about briefly about the items, because of course it's going to be up to the user to explore it and to interact with it. So the first session, again, we have displayed, so there's a possibility to click and be redirected to the YouTube documentary that we have shown at the very beginning. There is the first official, so to say, section is the section on trade, so the data on trade, and it offers an understanding, even an idea of the relevance of seaborne commerce in the region, and also the role played by the ports. As you can see, the total value of imports in Southeast European countries, and one, of course, can select the specific country and follow. For instance, here you see in Albania is going to be highlighted just in red, the rest is going to get more transparent. And then, of course, here the importance also of the containers. So the numbers that I was referring to during my presentation, the 20-foot equivalent units. And again, same principle. You click on the country that you're interested in, especially if it comes to Albania, it's very likely it's going to be Durrës. Greece is represented by Piraeus and Thessaloniki, and so on and so forth. Then the second component is the map, in which basically we're gonna see the map of Southeastern Europe, and these are all the ports that are subject of our case studies. In the report, our case studies are around 4 to 5 pages long with pictures. While these, in a way, offer this section of the tool offers a more synthetic way, more direct way to access the information we have collected. If you click, for instance, on the port here of Ploce, you're going to see, of course, the map from the satellite, and then a table with specific information that you also find in the report. And then here a text, which in a way is the shorter version and the more direct version, and I would say basically that summarizes the whole case study that is present in the report. So also for lazy readers as well, this might be also an easier way to get all the necessary information on the specific case study. Then there is the third main component, which is the typical trafficking route. It is basically a storytelling. It's a presentation. You're going to see. So let's start the journey, and then I'm going to basically talk about it. In here, we have created our own sort of like typical delivery of a shipment of cocaine from Latin America all the way to our regional references, specifically to Vienna, which is actually the venue of the Southeastern Europe Observatory. It is not a linear journey. It doesn't mean that everything starts, for example, here in Ecuador, some of the port of Guayaquil in Ecuador, and then stops, for example, in the port of Piraeus, and then goes to the port of Gioia Tauro. This was in honor of Anna, because, of course, also because the port of Gioia Tauro plays an extremely important role when it comes to cocaine from Latin America. Then stops in port of Rijeka, continues via land. So there are many phases, many stops that our hypothetical delivery of cocaine, and this is actually, as you can see, the autoplay is going along. And there are many unforeseen facts that we wish you to explore when you have a little bit of free time. And these are all, by the way, facts, so unexpected facts that we came across during our research. So these are unexpected, but at the same time is nothing new to analysts, to researchers, but also, of course, to law enforcement authorities, because this is all stuff that we have collected during the analysis of the various customs and police reports of operation. This is instead, the fourth component is named port vulnerabilities. As I said before, it's just, let me just get it better, it's just the interactive version of the visual that I have presented before. The only difference is that here, of course, you have, as I said before, a made-up port, and you can click on the specific section, for instance, the container terminal, and you're gonna basically have a short description of the specific vulnerability that you want to focus the attention on, and so on and so forth. So, for example, warehouses, this is passenger terminal, the ships at anchor, and so on. And then the last but not least is the container anatomy, something that we have addressed in our video documentary, but not in our presentation. Said that there are many ways to conceal illicit substances in containers, and in these visuals we basically summarize them all. As you can see here, there's many actually parts of the container one can use. If you click on a specific place, for example, inside boxes, or inside in container parts, and it's also the possibility to turn the container around, because actually we have also collected a lot of information on substances were hidden in the refrigerating system, and here you're going to see basically the description. And that's basically it. I want to waste more of your time, because we actually invite you to explore it more, and especially the typical trafficking route, which is a long journey.
Thank you, Ruggero. And yes, again, please use this tool and let us know what you think. Give us your feedback. We would really like this tool to be used. And so tell us what you think about it. So I think we are ready to open the floor for questions. I would like to encourage again our audience, please use the Q&A box to pose questions to our speakers. We have one question here. And I will now read it. Ports it's from Milutin Milosevic. He's saying, ports are the entry point, but they are not the end point. Have you analyzed how much the corruption in the back office, so deeper in countries of Southeastern Europe and on the way to Western Europe, contributes to efficiency of drug traffic through ports, and which are the forms of that corruption? Who would like to start first? Anna, you were the first you were the first one to have a presentation, so.
Yes, I can't speak for the whole of the region, and I think Ruggero can say more about that. But as a general thought, the answer is, in a way, that the more efficient is the port, the more efficient is drug trafficking. So this is the paradox here. So the more you make the port quicker in terms of management of container handling and controls, or the quicker it is to process container ships, how long does it take to actually handle all the arriving containers that are supposedly, leaving ship and getting onto the ground. The quicker you are, the more efficient you make drug trafficking. And even better, and this is not linked to corruption yet, but the more you arrange for the port to be well connected in terms of rails, in terms of roads, in terms of cyber facilitation, the better you're making drug trafficking, the smoother in a way. So this is a paradox that we all have to reconcile with. Then obviously there are issues with the region, and especially with certain parts of the region, as Ruggero mentioned, that are more prone and more traditionally involved with different forms of organized crime on the ground, which we would call extra-legal governance, which would facilitate drug trafficking differently. So it's not about being efficient, but it's about obviously controlling at the very beginning of the journey where and how the drugs will move. But I'll let Ruggero explain this further.
Yes, I actually, we have, so from a fieldwork also perspective, we have observed many different forms of corruption, which actually also vary depending on the type of criminal interest that certain criminal groups have like exploiting port premises. If we're talking about drugs trade, so illicit trade, then of course this can range from typical bribery from going from private security guards to customs for letting certain things go, to, for example, the very petty corruption at the dock workers, longshoremen level, trade unions, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we have also observed that major forms of corruption, and here I'm talking about, for example, mismanagement of public funds and political influence, and when it comes to specific choices, investments in general, where actually in case of ports capture, there had nothing really to do with illicit trade, but it was just criminal interest in the way in order to exploit the port as any other infrastructure, because of the economic role that the ports play in the economy, either of the city or actually at the national level. And so it really depends on the forms of corruption that we are talking about. Other than that, one thing which is also very important about this question is the fact that, and we have actually, we had it very solid in our mind, is the fact that the flows doesn't really stops in ports. And this is actually why our research was extended to other areas which are not really that close to ports. For example, in the case of Thessaloniki, we spent one day actually conducting fieldwork and walking through the wholesale fruits and vegetables wholesale market, which was around 20-25 kilometers away from the port, very well connected, but far away. And this was where most of the seizures also of cocaine were taking place. And again, there was a lot of corruption-related scandals regarding to the fact that private security was not really working well in those areas, and so on and so forth. So, it is very important to also understand that each port has its own history and identity, and it is very difficult, especially when it comes to forms of corruption, to generalize in the region.
Thank you. Sasha, anything on your side to add?
Yeah, so I will I think the level of corruption is not the same at the port in the southeastern Europe. So, and for example, at the port, what we actually saw from the different case studies and from different seizures and port practices and law enforcement action, that at the port the most risky are the customs, because they actually decide which container should be checked or not. And we have cases of arresting customs in Montenegro and Croatia. But actually we have one case that also criminals need customs. And the one action in Croatia actually succeed because the customs officer with the integrity actually said that criminals approach him and ask, so basically for a favor. So after that, when actually the container move, I think the police is more risky, because this is the agency, the service that actually open or close the borders in the state. So we actually have two main on the practical level. So I'm not discussing about this political influence and everything, but on the operational tactical level, that basically the customs in the port and the police outside the port are the most corrupt risk agencies.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions from the audience, so I would just like to last time ask, now is the chance. So please, if you have questions for our speakers, now is the time. But actually, I have a question, and I think it would be maybe also good to kind of close this discussion. So we presented all the findings of our research, a lot of interesting findings. If we could maybe summarize the main recommendations, what would those be?
Ruggero, that's on you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I suggested some, but obviously you have the ownership of the.
No, I mean, so just to give the audience a little bit of information regarding the recommendations. So our report has an entire section at the end dedicated to final observations and recommendations. Some are rather specific, such as, for example, our suggestion to deploy a specific organized crime unit or reference officer, which would be able to not only collaborate with customs and police in ports directly on a daily basis, but also be constantly in touch, for instance, with his or her alter ego in ports, which are relevant for our ports of reference for mainly two reasons. Either for crime-related matters, if, for example, if there is a history of specific connections between the ports of Marsaslok in Malta or Gioia Tauro, Valencia, and our port of reference, or logistically. So, for instance, what's been said already about the connection between, of course, the port of the Piraeus and Thessaloniki, or, for instance, the ports that are in the Northern Adriatic from both sides, meaning, for instance, Rijeka, Venice, and Ancona, which are daily connected operated by feeder boats. And others instead draw from existing best practices, such as, for instance, the long tradition, for example, of collaborations between Italian and Albanian law enforcement authorities. We have in the port of Durrës, Guardia di Finanza being there already for years, not only with their boats, but also with a building. So also the physical presence. An example which has been followed also by the Kosovo customs authorities, which have now, since the end of, I think, 2021 or beginning of 2022, they now have customs directly operating in the port of Durrës for all the goods that are destined for the Kosovar market. And this is something that, of course, we also have encouraged, and we encourage also for other countries to follow. For example, we have the Chamber of Commerce of Hungary that has recently opened an office, has deployed an officer in the port of Koper to facilitate the work and the paperwork of business companies from Hungary operated to Koper. And we definitely would suggest also that Hungarian customs would follow this the lead of the Chamber of Commerce. And then, of course, other recommendations range from the increase the presence of whatever digitalization processes of customs operation and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So I would again I'll invite our audience, if you haven't accessed our report, please do so, and more detailed set of recommendations you will be able to see there.
Anya, I see a question by
and now it's yes.
And I can quickly answer to that, because the answer is yes. We are already actually conducting this study. Sasha and myself, we are already working on this. The scope of the report is going to be definitely smaller. The topic is exactly the same. We're not going to go, of course, only for containerized cargo. We are looking for, in general, we're analyzing criminal markets in airports and aviation in general, with a specific focus. And here I think I can say it already, on the airports of Belgrade and Skopje. And that's it.
Great. We also have another question from Adriana. She's saying, thank you for the presentations. I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about how the field work at the ports was collected. Specifically in the case of Albania, could you expand on it? If the methods were qualitative or quantitative, length of time spent, if any interviews were conducted, and also was it challenging to gain access to this high security environment? Really interesting question for researchers. I think maybe all of you can briefly say something from your experience.
Yes, thanks, Adriana. I was brought in the project precisely because I had already some insight on how to approach research in ports. So that's why I could offer some of my experience and suggestions, and also lessons learned. I think overall, so the preparation for field work is obviously the main issue here. I've spent 2 weeks in Piraeus, and I know that the other researchers have been doing pretty much the same amount for each. But the point is not just what you do when you're in the field work, it's actually the preparation ahead. So most of the time you need a gatekeeper. The research will need to be initially for sure qualitative, and then eventually you might end up looking at some other statistics while you are preparing for field work. But the key issue here is to access gatekeepers. The gatekeepers are often, but not always, the port facility security officers, who are the people that by international law are the responsible person for security in the port. They are the ones who hold the key to the port, literally, as in they're the one who allow you in or kick you out. So, and they are the ones that once you manage to explain to them what you're doing, it can also get you to speak to others and eventually connect to others. Law enforcement might or might not be easier depending on the country, and obviously depending on the level of connections one has already. The most difficult I've normally found, but I'm sure Ruggero can expand on this, is border force, precisely because border force is the one that is often accused of facilitating certain activities, so they don't exactly love speaking about the vulnerabilities, but with some notable exceptions as well. So it's very much about trust as usual in this, about the researcher and trust. So a lot of preparation goes into securing every level of confidentiality and anonymity you can secure for any participant. Everything else, including data on seizures, data on types of drugs, is often already there for researcher to collate. It's often in some annual reports by certain organizations, and obviously, depending on the country, you have different level of trust for this data. But this also needs to be problematized with people on the ground. And the last thing, eventually, I would say, is that research imports really need to be visual. A lot needs to be actually seen about the port. You can't just do it from this, from your desk. You need to see how these things involve the city, most importantly, and how the activities of the various organizations and institutions are connected to one another. But this is the core, I guess, of any qualitative research in this case. And yeah, in my case, it's also, about smiling a lot and playing like, oh yes, please tell me more, a lot of mansplaining. In certain cases I had to endure. It's a very interesting dynamic. And I'll leave it to Ruggero for the Albanian case.
But in a regional context, the port of Durrës was, I would say, averagely hostile. Not particularly, meaning that especially, first of all, as said, the methods is always mixed. We do, of course, have a lot of desk research and preparatory work. And then for example, I conducted around 15 semi-structured interviews in Thessaloniki. And then I visited Durrës. In Durrës, for instance, we had the possibility to access the control room where police was basically sitting and had all the monitors with the CCTV cameras footage and everything. For example, we at the beginning, we were seen a little bit as a threat, of course, because one thing that has made clear to us, especially at the very beginning when approaching port managers, but also PFSOs, was that ports play a huge role for the economy of the city and of course of the nation, especially in small countries. And there's big interests at stake. So it was rather challenging also for certain peoples to open up. But at the end of the day, for instance, the beginning, as said, in Durrës was a little bit hostile. But then, for example, when we published the report, they then, through their social media, for instance, the Port of Durrës has published a long post praising our analysis and saying that it was unbiased and so on and so forth. So we make sure at least that we knock at all the doors, and then it's up to them to either answer our request or not. And but we acknowledge, of course, the relevance of also the fact that for some it may be not that easy. But one thing, speaking of experience, is probably the best category of interviewee is definitely retired customs. So people that don't really work anymore, but have recently retired. So they still are very fresh, and they have a lot to say, and they cannot say many things when they're still representing whatever institution they used to represent. So definitely institutions a lot, and retired if possible.
Thank you. And Sasha, from your experience, you also conducted fieldwork in 3 of the ports, if I'm correct? Yes.
Yeah.
Your experience.
Yeah. So, but basically, I don't have like too much to add. So it's like 2 weeks of field work, for one port, like talking with different stakeholders. So it's not only from institutions like customs and law enforcement. I think it's very also important to talk with people from civil society and with investigative journalists. So I think this is like very, very relevant, especially if you want like to compare different data. And not to have just one side on the story and to be objective. I think this is very important. And like in Ruggero case, so some ports were quite hostile and some not. For example, I will say names. So in Rijeka and in Bar, so the port authorities were quite open. Actually, also in Rijeka, I was in the control room and seeing CCTV cameras and everything, and people showing me what is there, what is here. So explaining what's going on. But like, for example, in Ploče was quite interesting, I will say, because this is like a very small port with around, I don't know, 6,000-7,000 people actually living in that place. And there was a lot of like conspiracy about what I'm doing here, etc. But in the end, it was also quite good. But actually, this is more or less.
Thank you. So it's been an hour and a half. I want to thank you. I want to thank our speakers, first of all, for sharing their knowledge, their experience. I think this discussion was really interesting and useful. I hope our audience is satisfied. I want to thank them for joining us. We had around 50 participants joining us today to hear three of you talking. Again, thank you all so very much. To our audience, please reach out to us if you have any questions or any comments about the report, about the tool that we launched. We would really like to hear from you. So it's time to close this webinar. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.